I mourned when Marcella died. She died April 14th, 2013. She had comforted the sick by playing the banjo and the accordion. She devoted herself to a life of service to God. She was the last of an 800-year movement, so I mourned for the death of the movement, even as I celebrated Marcella's life. And as I mourned, I learned. New expressions like Marcella's are emerging from the ashes of the old. Now, I am more convinced than ever that the medieval women's movement, known as the Beguines, have much to teach us today about creative Christian living in troubled times. In this video, you will learn just what it is about these ladies that makes them so attractive. Now, elsewhere I describe the origins and the life of the Beguines, and so I will only offer a brief summary here. The term Beguine identifies communities of women, especially in the 13th century, and there were some groups of men that were called Beguards, who chose to live the lives of Christian devotion and service without joining formal religious orders. Many lived in the same house, yet, not being nuns confined to cloisters, Beguines were free to volunteer in hospitals or leper colonies or elsewhere. They were committed to simplicity, yet many managed textile industries. Beguines braved the tightrope of active engagement within the urban world while practicing a Christ-like model of living that was anything but worldly. But let me get more specific. I will argue for the relevance of the Beguine option in answer to 4 questions. Question number 1. Why are the Beguines important to our contexts today? Rather than Rod Dreher's Benedict option, I advocate for what I call the Beguine option. I do so because I believe Beguines are more relevant and more accessible to people today, and therefore they're more important for us to consider. First, there is this vision of living a devout life without taking formal vows. The fact of the matter is, there are only a few people today who realistically would choose to give away all of their possessions, commit to a lifetime of celibacy, and move into a cloister for the rest of their lives. Yet, many Christians today are eager to live a Christian life that aims beyond mere faithful church attendance in an upwardly mobile neighborhood. The Beguines saw that vision, less institutional, but no less radical. Beguines saw beyond the dichotomy of working for a living and full-time missionary support of mendicancy. Through the combination of frugality, community living, and mutually supporting economic enterprises, Beguines found creative ways to provide for themselves while investing significant time in worship and ministry. Now, you see, what this means, and what I think is so important for us today, is that the Beguines model for us an active ministry sustained through common rhythm, geographic availability, and mutual vulnerable relationships. These are the very elements necessary to empower Christians to live beyond the dual traps of either self-protecting isolation or ministry burnout. Question number 2. How did the Beguines respond to the challenges of their world? Times were changing in the 13th century. An increasingly urban society and a new profit economy brought with them new social needs. New forms of poverty and disease were tangible concerns. Beguines risked stepping outside the known models to address these needs. Another challenge of the time was the distance of the church itself, particularly from the life of the laity, a laity which honestly desired more. The Latin liturgy, the canonical hierarchy, the developing scholastic theology, all propped up a barrier that seemed to separate the ordinary Christian from the life of holiness. Beguines tore down these walls, pioneering new forms of lay devotion, requiring neither foreign languages, nor institutional vows, nor advanced training. A third challenge was medieval patriarchal culture, where women simply had no voice. I mean, the very existence of Beguines as communities of socially active, devout women was a challenge to the political structure of the time. Women were expected to live either with the family or in the context of a cloistered order. Now, some Beguines, as a result, were forced to disband or to join formal religious orders. Yet, those that were permitted to mature established communities and businesses of women by women, gave birth to a new genre of spiritual writings, and influenced culture such that a few women, shaped by the spirit of the Beguines, like Brigida of Sweden, Catherine of Siena, and later Joan of Arc, were empowered to confront kings and shape the course of history. Question number 3. What helped them persevere in the midst of difficulty? How did the Beguines face this combination of social change and cultural misunderstanding? They met together. They held regular times of community prayer, designing their own worship services. They shared meals. They scheduled times to talk about their household and their ministry challenges. Mutual support goes a long way in tough times. They also sometimes had much needed help from outside their communities. Along the way, men of influence like Jacques de Vitré and Thomas of Cantimpré drew alongside the individual Beguines, some of them, and eventually became supporters of the movement as a whole, arguing for their case before secular and ecclesiastical authorities. But perhaps what helped them most, however, was their own relationship with God. They sensed profoundly, just as I sense today, that new forms of monasticism must be accompanied by new forms of mysticism. These women explored the depths of God's heart for themselves and their times through sustained prayerful practices of meditation. Historian Bernard McGinn devotes a significant portion of his volume on the flowering of late medieval mysticism to the spiritual writings of women connected to the Beguine movement. Hadowich, Mechthild of Magdeburg, Marguerite de Porret, others pressed deeply into God and recorded their visions. Thanks to their courageous prayer, Beguine communities survived for centuries. And thanks to the Beguines, Christian spirituality has never been the same. And finally, question number 4. What do the Beguines have to teach us today as missional Christians? Now, all I have to say at this point is, did you notice? Have you noticed, did you see the blend of the missional, service among the least, the prophetic, empowering the voice of those who have no voice, and the contemplative, profoundly mystical? As I'm sure you are aware, we desperately need the intentional integration of these 3 streams in the context of groups of Christian community, groups of Christians exploring Christian community on the edges of church and society today. Of course, the strategies of mission will change from generation to generation. The church structures surrounding us will rise and fall as medieval becomes modern and modern becomes postmodern. Nevertheless, the courageous, creative integration of this missional, prophetic, and contemplative streams within mutually supporting communities will always be a force for the glory of God. This is the vision of the Beguine Option. And I think it is a worthy vision for us today. Thank you.